Hey y'all, it's Red, your favorite non-binary creative life coach, back at it again with Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. We are still on chapter 2, and I'll be talking about a few quotes that I pulled from myths number 2 and 3 from Debunking Myths About Vulnerability. So the first myth that we're going to seminar about, that I'm going to just talk about my feelings. This myth is that people say, I don't do vulnerability, which is wild to me, that people think they can avoid it. So she starts off this section with a great quote from Madeleine L'Engle, an author, a pretty good author. She wrote that book about the Tesseracts, A Wrinkle in Time. Yep. Anyway, she writes here, when we were children, we used to think that when we were grown up, we would no longer be vulnerable. But to grow up is to accept vulnerability. To be alive is to be vulnerable. Ain't that the truth? Brené kind of starts out with this great comment about how this comment of I don't do vulnerability is said by certain demographics. It's often buttressed by a gender or professional explanation. Like, I am a man. I am not vulnerable. And then she calls us out and she's like, unfortunately, there is no get out of vulnerability free card. And, I know, hashtag not all men. But, it's a thing that happens that she experienced, that she did research on. So just, let that be. She expands upon Madeleine L'Engle's quote and by saying, even if we choose to stay out of relationships, which I might because of what you said about love earlier in the chapter, which I talked about in my last video. Dang, Brené. Even if we choose to stay out of relationships and opt for disconnection as a form of protection, we're still alive, and that means vulnerability happens. Yeah, you gotta go to the grocery store sometimes. You run the risk of being perceived, which is unfortunate for some of us. You run the risk of being seen by your friends when you're not presenting in a way that you want, So some questions that Brené asks people who don't think that vulnerability is a part of their lives. She likes to ask, what do I do when I feel emotionally exposed? How do I behave when I'm feeling very uncomfortable and uncertain? And how willing am I to take emotional risks? And as a creative living coach, and my focus being on, writers and writing, and I think those are some dang great questions to ask your characters. They can guide them one or the other direction, for better or for worse. For example, if they get uncomfortable, are they going to snap and run into disaster? Or are they going to retreat into themselves? Or are they going to try to get support somewhere? So it doesn't also just have to be emotional risks. It can also be physical risks, energetic risks, spiritual risks. How do you feel when you're feeling physically unsafe? Do you feel like you're backed into a corner? Do you lash out and fight back, or do you just kind of become a turtle in your shell? And I don't have a lot of experience with fighting, so one or the other is up to you. But it's just, I think it's interesting to think about it, what your character would do, So kind of building off of that, Brené talks about how if we try to be in denial about our own vulnerabilities, we often can move towards doing things that don't actually align with what we wish we were doing or want to be doing, or what feels good. Experiencing vulnerability isn't a choice. The only choice we have is how we're going to respond when we are confronted with uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And again, with writing, it's neat to see how people express a character when they're pretending to be something they're not. Like, do you tell us readers that this character is pretending, or do you just kind of make us think this is the real them and have like a bit of a twist at some point where we are revealed to that character? It's also important to look at it through the LGBT lens as well. It's like, are you pretending to be someone you're not? And you might be, and you might have to be safe. But it's also important to look at how, if you are, like, if you're not safe or something, then it's important to still look at how that is affecting your relationships and how you, on your own, are dealing with your environment and your inner world, because things can, like, in places that you feel unsafe, that's going to, leak into your heart, and there might be things that happen because of that. You might just be irritated more often because you feel like you're not free. And that this is all just hypothetical. Not everybody experiences this. But yes, it's all intertwined. And then we move on to the next myth, which is what Brené says is vulnerability is letting it all hang out. And people tend to ask her, isn't vulnerability just like oversharing? And she's like, no, actually. She says that if somebody decides to overshare with you and tell you like their deep, dark secrets or their trauma really early, she says it may be desperation or woundedness or even attention seeking, but it's not vulnerability. And I don't really like the words attention seeking because people use it in very dangerous ways. And it's not that it's without a nugget of truth, you know what I mean? Because sharing appropriately with boundaries, respecting your own boundaries and the other person's, it means sharing with people with whom we've developed relationships that can bear the weight of our story. Like, if you just meet someone that isn't literally your therapist and you just like dump on them some horrible stuff that happened when you were a child and you just expect them to be able to hold that and not have a reaction or react in exactly precisely the way you expect, like that ain't good. That ain't good. You that ain't it, folks. And I just wanted to mention that from an LGBT lens, it's important to have somebody to be vulnerable with. Not everybody has someone. Like, if you're not out, do you have at least one person or at least like a small internet community where you can be out? Maybe a secret Tumblr? I don't know. Just somewhere. And just noticing how that makes you feel when you're in that space, and how that can build on your courage, which vulnerability, adds up to. It might feel good, but also don't be surprised if having like one person or a couple people know about your inner workings, if that can bring up grief too, because it's normal to sort of grieve the rest of the world and not being able to share yourself with the world yet. Whatever happens is totally called for. Yes. So we go over here to talk about moving. Vulnerability is bankrupt on its own terms when people move from being vulnerable to using vulnerability to deal with unmet needs, get attention, the wrong kind of attention. Everybody needs attention, okay? Like, it's okay to ask for attention. But in this case, it's not the way. To deal with unmet needs, get attention, or engage in the shock and awe behaviors that are so commonplace to today's culture. Yeah. Like, are you just trying to shock somebody to get this response of like, oh, like, is it exciting for you to make somebody else uncomfortable in a way that isn't, productive? Because by behaving in this way, you might just be pushing them away. You might know that. This isn't the you specifically. This is like This is like whoever. Because it's a thing that happens. People get enjoyment from different things, and some people just get it from making others uncomfortable in situations where it's not helpful or productive to either party or the good of humanity. So then the research that Brené did regarding trust, the participants described trust as a slow building layered process that happens over time. And she describes it as a chicken or the egg issue, where we need to feel trust to be vulnerable, and we need to be vulnerable in order to trust. And there's no perfect way to know, like, oh, we crossed the threshold, I can trust this person. I mean, sometimes that happens, but that's not how it always is. It's more qualitative than quantitative. Less math, more feelings. So then she talks about this story with her daughter, how some people in her daughter's class are not nice, and how the teacher in the class, whenever the class was, doing something good, she would put marbles in a jar, and when the jar was full, then they would get like a pizza party or something, and when the jar was empty, then that would just suck. Because she would take them out when the class was majorly misbehaving. And so Brené talked to her daughter about how trust building is like the marble jar, and each action that people do with you, towards you, or even out in the world, can either put a marble in the jar or take a marble away. And it's up to you how many marbles you need to be able to trust with a certain amount or a certain type of information. Trust is built one marble at a time. I thought that's pretty cute. So she also talks to her daughter, and asks her questions about, how do you know you can trust someone, and what are some actions of trust that build that marble jar, per se. And I think it would be interesting to reflect upon that. So how do you know you can trust someone? And how do you build that trust mutually? You, specifically, how do you do it? What works for you? So Brené continues, and she talks about the Gottmans. God, I love the Gottmans. They're John and Julie Gottman are scientists at the University of Washington. They have this place called the Love Lab. Good Lord. Goals. And they've been researching for decades about relationships. And of course, written books. Highly recommend their website. Yes. So some quotes from one of John Gottman's books that Brené introduces is, What I've found through research is that trust is built in very small moments, which I call sliding door moments, after the movie Sliding Doors. I don't know the movie Sliding Doors. Maybe you do. Maybe you could explain it to me. I can't exactly reach out to John. He's kind of a big deal. Anyway, in any interaction, there is a possibility of connecting with your partner or turning away from your partner. One such moment is not that important, one little opportunity to turn towards or away. But if you're always choosing to turn away, then trust erodes in a relationship very gradually and very slowly. That doesn't feel good. And Brené talks about how it's hard to really pinpoint what is making a person feel like disengaged and detached, because it's not one big moment of betrayal that you can really pinpoint. I'm talking about the betrayal of disengagement, of not caring, of letting the connection go, of not being willing to devote time and effort to the relationship. So this disengagement tends to trigger shame and our greatest fears of being abandoned, unworthy, and unlovable. And it can make people feel really sort of uncomfortable, and like they're having some issues with their perception if there's no evidence of brokenness. And then she says, in fact, the overt or big betrayals that she mentioned before, like infidelity, I don't know, some yelling at each other or something, they're more likely to happen after a period of disengagement and slowly eroding trust. So when those big things happen, the little things have already been making hairline cracks. Like that marble jar is going to just poof, turn to dust, right? And she relates it to children. Children can't always articulate how they feel about their parents' disengagement when the parent stops making a real effort with them. And so sometimes kids show their parents what's happening inside by acting out and thinking that they'll at least get some sort of attention from their parents, some evidence of care, right? And she finishes this section with, trust is a product of vulnerability that grows over time and requires work, attention, and full engagement. Trust isn't a grand gesture. So like don't try that love bombing. You can't just buy somebody some like a car and then ignore them the rest of the time. Like, not it, picking a flower on the way home from work every day and giving it to somebody, or hugging them when you get home from work every day, much more important than if you just get some big stuffed animal and then never talk to them, Also, from a writer's standpoint, it's important to think about how we get our readers to trust in our characters or as their role in the story, especially if we plan to pull the rug out from underneath the reader later. So I'm just gonna nerd out a little bit here. I'm watching an anime called Attack on Titan, and I'm not gonna spoil anything. I'm just gonna say that there are some surprises, RE characters. And I am really into, I like feeling things. I like it when characters make me feel things, even if I'm like mad. So I think at least this show did a really good job of building up our trust in, like all the characters, main characters, secondary characters. There's a lot of characters. And then pulling that rug out from under us. And even if the rug is never pulled, it's just important to have some sort of consistency, so we know there's a foundation to that we can trust will be there as we continue reading the book, so that we know that we're reading it for a reason. The book, story, whatever we're writing, consistency is good. So those are my thoughts on the second and third myths of vulnerability from Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. If you have any feelings, make a comment. And I'll see you later.